I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. I welcome Professor Stephen F. Cohen, New York University, Princeton University. Good evening to you, Professor.
Shall we talk about bars?
Yes, let us turn now to the Muller Report, the summary that we're given by the Attorney General. Right. Please continue.
Well, I feel awkward promoting, and that's what it is, my own recent book, War with Russia, ? A book that grew out of my broadcast with you and therefore covers the period, the 5 years we've been together, from 2013 to the present. The reason I mention it, though, is that all the subjects that are treated by what apparently is a 300 or 400 page document, the Muller Report, which eventually we will see, I'm sure, but which we know significant things about from the Attorney General's summary. All those things you and I discussed over the last 5 years, almost weekly, in one way or another. And, as you say, I later wrote them up, and they're in my book, and I have gotten quite a few emails since Barr's summary was published a few days ago, congratulating me on having gotten the story right. But the first thing I want to say is that none of the few of us who were more than skeptical about RussiaGate we openly assailed it as a story, a narrative, a dangerous one without facts. None of us should gloat or feel jubilant, because contrary to the editorials in the newspapers today, RussiaGate is not over. It has not expired. In a way, it may just be beginning for a number of reasons. First of all, an obscenity like this in history, a fraud like this in history, we know from other cases, do not go away, sometimes ever. They live on as legend and myth and part of somebody's narrative. People will find it useful to return to the story. And this, as you said, John, the key story is that Putin's Kremlin put Donald Trump in the White House, and that Trump, therefore, was from the beginning and has been, choose your word, that the American mainstream media used, a Kremlin asset, a Kremlin agent, or a Putin puppet. Mueller found otherwise. He said in plain language, there is no evidence for this. And yet, RussiaGate, like Count Dracula, will never end, because new political blood will be fed to this vampire. Because, in part, in the 3 years it's lived, it began, I can track it exactly, the RussiaGate story. It was, and you know it because I think you were offered it. It was being leaked in the form of the Steele dossier, which itself was fraudulent, to the American media as early as the middle of 2016. Right.
We have the date sometime in the middle of September when major reporters from major publications, they know who they are, were briefed by Steele.
No, I want to correct you. It goes back at least to July, because one article did appear.
Franklin Foyer's piece in early July, yes.
That's right. Called, do you remember the title? Putin's Puppet. He had clearly been given some of Steele's so-called material. But I believe you were offered it and rightfully declined it as well. But since that time, the RussiaGate fraud, has become a kind of theocratic cult. And it has millions and millions of self-interested and unwitting followers. So it's not going to go away. What's really interesting, I don't know if you saw today's New York Times. Probably it was on the web yesterday. But a writer of the web went around to the editors of the primary media outlets that have, for 2.5 to 3 years, promoted the RussiaGate story. That included the editor of the New York Times, her own newspaper, the editor of the Washington Post, the editor of BuzzFeed, which published the so-called Steele dossier.
January of 2017, yes.
Right. The president of CNN and others that have been the mainstream inside the Beltway, enormously influential media outlets that have pumped this RussiaGate story for years. And she asked them, in light of what Barr, the Attorney General, has told us about Mueller's findings, do you have any regrets? And to a man, they are all men, they said no. We would report it exactly as we did. This is nothing less than astonishing, John. Nothing less than astonishing. But it also tells us it's not going to end. There's not going to be a correction.
Professor, I want to turn to what damage this has done to the American system, let alone the breakdown in relations with Russia. Steve, damage to our institutions by RussiaGate. Please continue.
Well, it seems to me that while everybody in the aftermath of Barr's summary of Mueller's no collusion report is talking about who and what and said what, did what, the real issue, the real question we have to ask is what damage have these RussiaGate allegations that a Kremlin agent is in the White House done to our basic institutions. Think about elections to begin, because I think we have 3 or 4 institutions to ask about. That they were able, they being the Russians, because the Russians means Kremlin and the Putin, the way it's written, they were able to dupe the American voters, the American people, the electorate. So what does that tell us about the integrity of our electoral democracy, which is based in theory on the integrity of the elections and the common sense?
Let me give you an answer, Steve. What it tells us is that still there is that doubt about democracy, that the people are too stupid to lead themselves. That's what we're hearing here, that we're so stupid that somebody waking up in Petersburg and claims to be Tennessee for Trump is going to convince me to vote for Donald Trump.
But at a more serious, that's a serious level, but project that into the future. How long will it be, to put this negatively, when some losing or aspiring candidate anywhere, nationally, regionally, locally, does not say, the Russians are working against me, or the Russians worked against me? Robbie MOOC, who was Hillary Clinton's losing campaign advisor, wrote recently an op-ed piece in the Washington Post and said, there will be a next time. Now, this has been implanted like a ticking time bomb in our institutional system.
MOOC is one of those people who knew cynically that this was a campaign prank. He knew it, and he's still maintaining that prank has substance. That's why I react so negatively to MOOC.
But you could go on if you wanted to be more negative toward Mr. Nuke and ask if the Russians, spending, I think it's estimated $100,000, were able through social media to sway voters to Trump, why Robbie MOOC with how many dollars did Clinton spend on the election?
$1 billion. Who knows? They lie.
Let's say with $1 billion at his disposal, why he couldn't figure out how to use Clinton's social media to win votes for her. So it's preposterous, John, but I submit to you, and we can revisit this in the months ahead, that it's really dangerous because we've cast doubt on the pillars of American democracy, namely our elections and, John, the institutions that result from those elections, the Congress, but above all, the presidency.
I want to add, Steve, that for 2.5 years, there has been a search by those sympathetic to the allegation that Trump is a stooge of the Kremlin. There's been a search to show the Russians sought to get inside voting machines, electronic voting machines in various states. The story has never been proved, but that search is ongoing, and there's no reason to believe that it's going to stop. You recall there were articles in the midterm election of 2018 anticipating that perhaps in some fashion the Democrats would lose this or that district. The Democrats have come up with a permanent excuse for failure, and they're going to use it again, Steve, in 2020. That's what MOOC is talking about.
I lack your optimism only 50%. Why would it be only the Democrats? Why not would the Republicans, if they lose an election, let's say the next presidency, revert to this allegation that we were cheated by the Russians? We talked about this a lot. And I explore the theme, how you make an institution illegitimate, in my book, War with Russia. But let's think about the Trump presidency. Since July, and certainly since late, the zealous promoters of the RussiaGate story, mainly Democrats, but not only, said Trump was an illegitimate president. He had not fairly won the election because the Russians had intervened. Now, I don't know that we've ever had quite exactly that kind of alleged scandal in American history.
I want to mention, Steve, that on January 5th, I have this memory. January 5th, 2017, in the Oval Office, Barack Obama met with many of his intelligence chiefs. And one of the discussions, including James Comey, one of the discussions that day was, can we trust the president-elect to brief him on our concerns about the Russians interfering on our election? So the doubt about the presidency started under Barack Obama, didn't wait until Donald Trump was sworn in. Already the rot was in the system. What is peculiar is that we now have reason to believe that the people in that room, in that meeting, knew that the origins of RussiaGate was a fraud. It's a mirror, looking at a mirror, Steve, but please continue.
Well, they knew it because the intelligence chiefs who were in the room, presumably John Brennan of the CIA and possibly James Clapper, then director of
I don't know that
Intelligence.
Clapper was there, but I believe Comey was there, and certainly Rice, the National Security Advisor, and we're told that the vice president attended at some point during the day. So major figures of the administration.
Well, let's not let slip, though, a fundamental point, which I believe to be a fact, also in my book, that when we ask who created RussiaGate, because it didn't just evolve from spontaneous developments. It was something that was manufactured. Let me just end what we said about the presidency by something that I was actually moved by, spoken by Donald Trump. I'm rarely, if ever, moved by Donald Trump in that respect. That's absolutely right. That may be the wisest thing he's ever said. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, given what's happened, will it happen to another president? And will it, again, cause, what's the word, denigration, lack of faith in the American presidency? Which then brings us to other institutions. And the one that was most responsible, I guess, after the intelligence services for RussiaGate, the media. Right. Now, media is a capacious word. It could mean what you and I do every week. But by media, most people who try to evaluate its role mean the really influential media that resonates daily inside the Beltway.
The New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS, ABC, NBC, the legacy media of the 20th century.
Well, and to which we now have to add, because they're enormously influential in political circles, CNN and MSNBC, the cable channels. This is new in our recent lifetime, John, the influence and the synergy here you could see every night. Look at the number of New York Times and Washington Post correspondents who are on panels on CNN and MSNBC. Not only did that not happen in the past, it was not permitted by the publishers, but now you have a story generated by one of these newspapers, and that night there's a panel discussion of the story featuring the reporters, and that's become 1,000-fold truer during the RussiaGate era. So you have these powerful national, all of them with syndicates, by the way, and affiliates across the country. I mean, down in my hometown of Owensboro, Kentucky, I get letters from people who see things on CNN or read them, a story syndicated in the Owensboro Messenger Inquirer, the local paper, from the New York Times or the Washington Post, a RussiaGate story saying, Steve, can this be true? Did Trump really get put in the White House by Putin? So this is a national phenomenon, but its biggest impact, of course, is in Washington. And the media's role during RussiaGate can only be described as malpractice. Now, a number of people are looking at this very, very carefully. I would recommend, for example, an article just published by, I think, an old friend of mine, and I think a mutual acquaintance, Matt Taibbi. You know Matt.
Yes, I spoke to Matt yesterday about it, yes.
So Matt, I don't know if you've read it yet, has published, looks to be about 10,000 words. I didn't count them, but a very, very careful examination of how the media handled these RussiaGate stories as they unfolded. And it's very damning, John. It's very damning.
Let me tell one little anecdote from the piece that I did not know. Greg Miller, the esteemed investigative reporter for the Washington Post, traveled to Prague with others to search for the evidence that Michael Cohen, the president's attorneys, had met with Russian agents there as charged by the Steele dossier. They asked at every hotel they could find, has Michael Cohen been here, showing his picture. They could find no evidence that Michael Cohen was in Prague. And yet, Steve, that search was never reported. Never reported. The one aspect of the Steele dossier, the 5-year recruiting of Trump, the blackmail threat, the matter of Trump's Moscow hotel, all those things were not verified. But the one they tried to verify, Prague, they could not, and it did not pass it along. Now, maybe that's not malpractice, but it certainly does tell you that you cannot trust the narrator.
Well, let's be clear, and we've talked about this many times, so I risk repeating myself to the point of maybe I shouldn't, but it's all about facts and evidence. And it's not just true of the media. I'm a scholar. You're a broadcaster journalist. My medical caregiver is a doctor. If any of us do not proceed on the basis of fact, we malpractice. That's the word for it, malpractice. Doctors can't get away with it. They get sued. But the media gets away with it, and they don't get caught until it's too late. And what was characteristic of mainstream media coverage of RussiaGate is they were running endlessly long stories and running them endlessly based on leaks, not facts. So if I call you up, John, and say, John, I've got a hot tip for you, and I tell you anything, and you go on air with it the next day, and you haven't fact-checked, and fact-check means having one or two other people confirm what I told you, or maybe a printed document, that you don't do that, you have malpracticed. And that's what they did systematically. The process, people who have never written for a newspaper do not know that when you write for the news pages or the opinion pages, they, quote, fact-check you. They have a team. I mean, often they have a legion of fact-checkers who underline what you've written and raise question marks alongside anything you've written that they think needs to be verified. Then the editor you're working with rings you up, or in today's day, emails you and said, look, Cohen, you said here, we need a document, or we need your source, or how you know that. And if you don't reply to their satisfaction, they will not run the piece, or they'll make you take that out. That stopped. When I read the New York Times and the Washington Post and the New Yorker, and when I listened to MSNBC and CNN, I knew that they had stopped fact-checking. I mean, they were not only matters of empirical fact, like relating episodes that in a way that the episode didn't happen, but asserting things for which there was no evidence. So I think when the big reckoning comes, which will mean serious people joining Matt Taibbi and an even fuller autopsy, because Taibbi thinks this may kill the mainstream media. I don't think so, because the mainstream media is like Count Dracula. He dies in every film, but for 50 years, another film reappears and he's in it again. There's a kind of vampire-ish like quality to the way the media survives its deaths. But this is really bad. I think it's, in my lifetime, in the three major misrepresentations by the American media of things related from Russia. That was the Russian Civil War, where they were sure the whites would win, the American media was. The post-Soviet 1990s, a catastrophe for Russia, where the American media presented it as a glorious transition to prosperous democratic capitalism. And now RussiaGate, that this is worse. This is worse. And there's almost no way to say the way the media has been tarnished, in the sense that people who, since they've not been told the truth, or given a balanced picture, are losing, and polls show faith in the media is already low, are losing faith. And yet the mass media is a pillar of the American democratic system. So I think we chalk that up as another institutional damage or cost of RussiaGate.
Steve Cohen is here to comment on what damage is done now to the Democratic Party, Steve. They did very well in the midterm election of 2018, and they're entertaining victory now. So how are they damaged?
So we're left, aren't we, John, with Winston Churchill, who said that a politician thinks about today and a statesman thinks about tomorrow. And the Democratic Party thought only about today, because it, above all other institutions in our democracy, drove, fostered, perpetuated, kept alive, used for its own purposes, the RussiaGate fraud. That's just a fact. And I say that as someone who's been a nominal Democrat all my life. It's just a fact. In some ways, it's captured by this notion of the resistance. You know about the resistance,
yes,
right?
Capital R, right.
And when I first saw that, I thought, what the heck? No, the resistance was General Charles de Gaulle leading the resistance to the Nazi occupation of France. He was abroad in exile, but abetted by brave people in the resistance underground inside Nazi-occupied France. This is preposterous. How dare these people, they could call themselves the opposition to Trump, that's fine, call themselves the resistance. That excess, rhetorical and political, has led to so many others, because it was the resistance or the attitude of being a resistance inside the Democratic Party that drove this RussiaGate, that led people. New York Times columnists were not talking about John Birchers in Indiana, John. New York Times columnists and editorialists, and not only New York Times ones, to literally call the President of the United States a traitor, a Kremlin puppet and a traitor. There's no precedent for that, John, in American history. So we have to ask, has that done damage to the Democratic Party? Well, I don't think you can answer the question simply by saying, well, we'll see how they do in the next presidential election or in the next off-year elections. Yeah, they picked up votes in the House last time around. But this is a cancer inside the Democratic Party. And I will give you an example. It's not going to die. Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, whom many Democrats, not myself, but many Democrats regard as the most admirable progressive Democratic candidate for the presidency, tweeted, I believe yesterday, that he's going to introduce a resolution in the Senate that the American president must represent American and not Russian interest. This is to institutionalize, if he's able to do this, the Russophobia, and we'll come to our main theme now, of the new Cold War. I mean, why doesn't Sanders just go for rewrite the Constitution? Not only do you have to be, 35 years old,
36,
John?
36.
36. You got to be 36 years old and fervently anti-Russian to be a candidate for the presidency in the United States. I mean, people have used this expression, derangement syndrome.
Yeah, the Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah, and they, by the way, the first person I ever saw use it in regard to Putin. He called it the Putin derangement syndrome. That Putin just drove people crazy to the point where they said preposterous things. But it certainly happened in this country, mainly inside the Democratic Party, in regard for Trump. But John, I submit to you, it will not go away. It cannot go away. It's been institutionalized in the institution of the Democratic Party.
Steve, we just have a couple of minutes, and this will be a theme that we follow in subsequent weeks, but I want to flag it here. I think that this scandal so far has badly, badly damaged relations with Russia. Badly damaged. Villainized Putin and the Kremlin in a way that's completely undeserved now that we see that there was nothing to the collusion. They didn't actually recruit the President of the United States. But at the same time, the new Cold War shows no instances of flagging. In fact, the lines are growing deeper between Moscow and Washington as we speak.
How much time do we have?
We have about 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Oh, I don't need that, and then you can comment on it. I set it up as follows, and I again refer to my book, War with Russia, because one of the main themes of that book, maybe the main theme, is the new Cold War with Russia. And the secondary theme is that this Cold War is much more dangerous than the one we survived. And you and I have talked about that probably at least 50 to 75% of the time that we've talked
as we've
for
watched
5
the
years.
Cold War escalate the last 5 years. And
So
Steve, I have to regard this present circumstance of the Muller Report as an escalation. We have not heard from Moscow.
You're exactly right. And alas, we haven't seen Mueller's full document, but according to Barr's summary, Mueller does buy into this notion that the Russians attacked us, our election, in 2016. It isn't true. But let me end for tonight on my part by reading you something written by Fred Weir. I don't know if you know who Fred is, but he is not only the longest standing American correspondent in Russia, he works for the Christian Science Monitor. He is the most experienced and the wisest. And here's what he dispatched just after Barr's summary of the Muller Report. And I can do it in 10 seconds.
No, take your time. Go ahead. We've got time.
I'm reading now Fred Weir, W-E-I-R, who files and has for, I think, maybe 2 decades. He lives in Moscow, the Christian Science Monitor. He says, relations with Russia are probably irreversibly spoiled. Mm-hmm. He means in regard to RussiaGate. When this all started, most Russians had positive attitudes toward the United States. Not only has that turned negative, but many Russians I know, let me stop here and say Fred knows hundreds, if not more, Russians. Many of the Russians I know are derisive and scornful, having watched Americans spewing endless nonsense about an all-powerful Putin who can control American voters with Twitter bots and Facebook posts and make Putin's own man, President of the United States. This is not from me. I've said that to you on your broadcast. You'll remember that.
Yes.
It's in my book, War with Russia. But when Fred Weir, who has much greater authority in generalizing about what Russians think than I do, he has 100-fold more than I do, writes this. This is testimony that cannot be ignored.
Steve, I want to emphasize here what we're identifying is a problem that's going to get worse into the future, if I understand it. And we don't know how bad RussiaGate's going to get. I can easily see this being litigated right up to the election in 2020. And we don't know if Donald Trump will win or not, but the allegations will hang over everyone, including the allegation that Vladimir Putin is an enemy of the United States, an enemy who must be militarily blunted. We've always speculated on the possibility of an accident leading to a catastrophe. I don't think that's improved even slightly after the Attorney General's summary of the Mueller document.
The bad news is, and this is not a bad news, good news joke, this is an empirical report. The bad news is that RussiaGate, these allegations, have literally criminalized a policy that kept us safe in the nuclear 20th century, the policy known as détente. RussiaGate has condemned, quote, countless contacts with Russians. We need countless contacts with Russians to avoid conflict. So on the American side, even if Trump revives his campaign pledge to cooperate with Russia, it's very difficult to see how, unless he gets better advisors both about Russia and politics, he would be permitted to do it here. The good news is...
We have 30 seconds, Steve. Go ahead.
The good news is, from my point of view, is that on the Russian side, you almost unanimously, never unanimously, but substantially across the Russian political spectrum, the reaction to the news that Mueller found no collusion has been great. Now maybe we will have a second chance to mend relations with America. In other words, the Russian political class still wants daytime.
Professor Stephen F. Cohen, New York University, Princeton University, eastwestaccord.com is the website. War with Russia is the book. I'm John Batchelor.